afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which we're organizing together with the Embassy of Sweden and the Swedish Australian Chamber of Commerce and Fossil Free Sweden. Today we'll be talking about the roadmaps for fossil-free competitiveness. And I will shortly introduce our ambassador, Henrik Cederin, who will open up this online event. Before I do that, I also like to mention a little bit of the practical details. We do have a Q&A towards the end of the session. And if you have questions, please write them down in the chat. Or you can also do it in the Q&A box, which is on the Zoom link. We will record this webinar as well, and we will post it on socials and on our website post the event. Okay, well, thank you so much, and welcome His Excellency Henrik Cederin.
Thank you very much, Camilla. At the Embassy of Sweden in Canberra, we are really thrilled and delighted to be involved in organizing this webinar today. To begin with, I want to thank all the participants, to all of you who have signed up to join us this afternoon. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout. I also want to thank the Swedish Australian Chamber of Commerce. As always, it is great working together with you. And we share the same objectives, and working together as Team Sweden Australia, we make great strides, I think, in furthering the relations and the interaction between Sweden and Australia. And today, of course, we have another important partner in fossil-free Sweden and in our roadmap representatives. More about them later. And at this point in time, can there really be a more important topic to choose for an effort of this sort than climate change and the need that we all face to speed up the transition from a dependence on fossil fuels to the creation of societies and economies that run on renewable energy. We are now in a very critical decade where much needs to be done before 2030, unless we want to see catastrophic effects to our planet. I think we've all read and heard about the warnings, now most recently put forward by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their latest report. And we are also right now in the very important build-up phase to the climate conference COP26, starting in Glasgow, United Kingdom, on the 31st of October, in just 6-7 weeks away from now. And this is a conference where we really need to see the world come together with great expressions of greater commitment in the fight against climate change. The pace of change is quick, and previous objectives and commitments need to be updated to reflect the seriousness and the urgency that we have in this situation and the challenges that we're facing. For today's discussion, where ideas and solutions to these problems will be presented, we have a great guest speaker from Sweden, Mr. Svante Axelsson. Svante is a household name in Sweden when it comes to sustainability issues, climate, and the environment. Today, he serves as the national coordinator for Fossil-Free Sweden, the Swedish government initiative launched in 2015 to make Sweden the first fossil-free welfare nation in the world. Before that, for a total of 16 years, Svante served as Secretary General for the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation. We're also very pleased to have Mr. David Leitch as our moderator today. David is the founder of ITK, an energy consultancy specializing in financial analysis of electricity, gas, and decarbonization. David also contributes to the public debate by publishing voluntary research and analysis with RenewEconomy, a leading website focusing on clean energy. So we are really delighted to have both of you here with us this afternoon, David and Svante. And with these words, I wish to start the discussion. We're all anxious and eager to hear it. And please, the floor is yours.
Svante, thank you very much for those introductory words, Mr. Ambassador Henrik. I would add that in the second half of the session today, we have two additional representatives, and you'll excuse it if I make some pronunciation. Ellen Einebrant, who's the Head of Communications and Climate Strategies at the Swedish Recycling Industries, and Operations Manager for Circular Sweden, a modern concept. And Marianne Hedberg, who's environmental expert for the Swedish Construction Federation. We're going to start the session with Svante, I think, setting the scene with a few slides. Over to you, Svante.
Thanks for that, and thanks for being invited to this webinar. And I will very briefly give a picture of the situation in Sweden and also about the industrial revolution that we now are part of. So please, can you start? Yeah. The first picture here you can see, we have done a lot already. We have reduced the emissions by 29% and increased the GDP by 86%. And that's a very, very good starting point, because our task and our message is that we can increase our welfare by being fossil free. If we can do that, we can increase the welfare for all people in Sweden. And that's the new logic, you can say, the new narrative that we are starting. And we have done it before. We have taken some steps that prove that this is possible. Next step, next picture. We reduce a lot of energy in Sweden. We have rather high consumption per capita, especially when we look at the electricity production and the consumption. And as you see, we have a lot of hydropower. Nuclear power is not so a lot of them today. We have reduced 2 plants. So it's not so, we have, I think, 47 terawatt hour 2020. And we also have increased the wind power production since 2019. So we have a lot of hydrogen, a lot of nuclear and wind, you can say. And our vision, you can say, and our task is to more or less double the production of electricity to phase out all fossil energy in the system. Next picture. As you see here, we have a lot of heavy industries, transports. Yeah, I think it's very, very it's unusual, you can say, compared to other neighbors in the Nordic countries, that we have a lot of heavy industries and they use a lot of electricity and, of course, today, a lot of fossil energy. The main task for us now is to reduce emissions from the transport sector. We have more or less fossil-free electric sector, and which I will mention later, we also reduce the emissions more or less from the heat sector. So the first step and the second step is more or less fossil-free. So now we are focused on the third step, and we are now, the target is to reduce the emissions from the transport sector by 70% to 2030. And I think that's the most ambitious target in the world. And then we take step by step, which I also will show you later on about the roadmaps. Next picture. And this roadmaps cover more or less 70% of our emissions. And I will come back to that later. So we have got a good scope over what we have to do. And it looks rather easy if you compare to the situation in the world. And we have also very good situation with a very strong ambitions from the industrial sectors, and also, of course, our natural resources. But we have a good speed now, and with the possibilities to be one of the first fossil-free welfare nations in the world. Next step, next picture. As I mentioned before, we have done it before. We started already in 1991 to introduce the first carbon tax in the world. It has a huge impact on the heat sector, that we have switched from fossil energy to biomass, you can say. We have also have an extension in the district heating. So a lot of district heating in different parts of the countries. We have also a lot of heat pumps that we introduced in early 1980s, and also, of course, increase the biofuels in the industry, as I mentioned. So we have done a lot of work so far, and it has been easier than we thought it would be. And that makes us rather proud and strong to take the next step, and why we also see the possibilities to be a fossil-free welfare nation. Next picture. And then we come into this roadmaps. And as we heard, my role is a national coordinator for Fossil-Free Sweden. And I invited different industrial sectors to produce their own roadmap. You can say bottom-up process. And they own it, and they have done it themselves with support from us. And it really surprised me that they see the possibilities, because now we talk about how can we increase the competitiveness by being fossil-free. We don't only talk about to be fossil-free, we talk about how can we increase the competitiveness. And that has been a really successful perspective, you can say, and open up the discussion. We don't talk about burdens and costs and all that. We see how can we speed up and transform our economy, because the market is changing very rapidly just now. So many companies are afraid of that the process will go too slowly. So they put pressure on the government to step up and to reduce obstacles much earlier than before, because otherwise they are not a part of the market. They believe that the situation is the transformation is very rapid just now, and we need to be part of this new market and new solutions. As you see, we have a lot of different sectors, and the next picture show us also that they take strong decisions and targets already 2030. You can see the aviation want to be fossil-free 2030, climate neutral cement 2030, and automotive industry produce cars. 80% of the new cars want to be, we think it would be 80% rechargeable cars, and even heavy trucks. I think 50% of the new trucks 2030 will be electric trucks. And in construction, that's more 20% of our emissions will reduce the emissions by 50% to 2030. So they have a strong agenda, and they are now working very hard to starting this process. And we got for 2 weeks ago the first fossil-free steel. I took it in my hands, and this autumn we will see the first fossil-free truck from Volvo AB in Gothenburg. So that's the story, you can say. They are part of industrial revolution, and the most amazing now is that it's so strong support for industrial leaders. They see the possibilities. I think it's good for the people, for the GMP, and we have many different industrial projects now. We have the first gigafactory, battery factory in Europe. We have also the steel production. We have transformation of refineries to biorefineries, and the climate neutral cement, for mention some examples. And the language which is the most important thing, that we think we can do this and even increase jobs and growth and also welfare. And this story makes it much, much easier for the politicians to be brave and take strong decisions. And I think it's an interesting message. Also, when we talk about Glasgow and how bad we can see different countries will have ambition targets to this Glasgow process. I mean, if we believe it's very, very heavy, costly, and so on, the politicians don't dare to put a strong ambition on the table. So I think this message has surprised myself, and I think the situation now is very, very good for Sweden and for the debate. Yes, David.
Thanks, Svante. That's I think you have set the scene very well. And let me say at the outset how great it is to hear such a big level of enthusiasm and optimism coming through. It's so good to be on the bus in just about any endeavour that requires you to bring along the people. I'd like, if I could, to start by going back to the beginning, perhaps even before fossil-free Sweden came into being, and ask how it was that Sweden came to be so early in deciding as a country to do something about carbon.
The starting point was, of course, the oil crisis in 1970s. And then we started to produce nuclear power. And we more or less built a new electricity capacity. Half of the capacity was built in 10 years. So that was the first, you can say, crisis in this oil sector. Then we have the next step. It was to introduce biomass. And the starting point was, of course, to introduce this tax. And I think we have a lot of forests and a lot of land. So it was also a good way to produce our own energy, to create jobs and welfare in our country. And that combined with this environmental crisis, we understand that was coming. And we have strong support, you can say, from the people that are very aware about the situation and love the nature and the country, and a strong environmental movements that makes us as a good consumer. And together we have created this vision. And I think we say that often you need two for tango, but we think we need a square dance, because we need different parts have to take step by step together. The consumer, the local municipalities has been very, very strong leaders to be part of this fossil-free story, and also industrial leaders. So when we come together now and have a vision, I think we have a great possibility to be a very good example in the world.
No, I think that's undoubtedly the case. And you mentioned that the economy provided the cost driver, if I can think about it that way. On the other hand, sometimes people approach it from the risk that climate change poses. Do you see that the risk in Sweden, or to the people of Sweden, is any different to the risk to everyone else?
I don't think so. I think the risk is much, much more heavier in other parts of the world. But when you talk about risk, I think the risk now for the companies is not to be part of the market. They're afraid of not being there in 2030. And that is why they need support from the state and EU to transform our industry in an open economy. So the big risk now is not to change, is to be too late in this process.
Indeed. And it interests me because in Australia, and we won't compare countries, but I make the observation that in Australia, it's the people that are so in favour of the change, and some parts of business less so, because the economic incentives are different, and this is only natural in business. But of course, in every country, in every area of business, the interface between government and business, and the forming of policy, the role of the private sector as opposed to the role for public sector policy, how much do you want to force things on people, and how much do you want the private sector to drive it? Can you tell me about the role that fossil-free roadmaps and the organisation plays in who leads and who follows? And
I think the politicians, what's the starting point? They come together, and after the Paris Agreement, which was a very, very important decision, of course, because that was the first signal to all companies that all people in the world are going to buy fossil-free products. So without Paris Agreement, it was not possible. But after Paris Agreement, we also strengthened our targets in the parliament, and we got a very, very strong support from more or less all parties to take a decision to reduce our emission and be climate neutral to 2045. And that was the starting point, and we also introduced the climate law and also introduced this initiative, Fossil Free Sweden. And after that, you can say that the bowl has gone over to the companies, and they have taken it and believe that they can step up much more strong than we first thought, and they produce these roadmaps and say we can do it faster, and we don't see the possibilities, but we need to reduce the obstacles. You need to help us. So it's a sort of informal contract. We can do this if you can also do something in the parliament and take some important decisions. And that make a pressure on the politicians so they can be there and take more difficult decisions, because they have a strong support from not only from the environmental movement, but also from the industrial sectors. And now we have this two for tango. So they're helping each other. And I am running between them and want to reduce obstacles for the politicians, because they are afraid of not have support from the people. And we also reduce the obstacles so they can build these new industrial sectors. And they, of course, sometimes need support and in different way. But the most important thing now is that the state need to produce the infrastructure, not only pay money direct into the companies, but we need the infrastructure, hydrogen, electricity, railway, and these things, and of course also charging places all over the country. So when I talk with different leaders, they say the first thing the state need to do now is to focus on the infrastructure, so it will be possible for us to phase out the fossil energy.
There are so many things to talk about, and I guess I should never forget, and I'm sure people from Sweden are far more aware of it than I ever will be, that Sweden is a Nordic country, and it's a part of Europe, and so the trade is always very important. And if I get time, I might come back and ask about Sweden's hydroelectricity, which I think, along with Norway, can be very important in firming up at a very competitive cost the whole of the European electricity. But let me talk about an industry that many people think about, and which you mentioned in your slides, and that is steel. It's one thing to produce steel with hydrogen, and I think there are a number of different technologies that are for doing that, and you have produced some, which is wonderful. It's another thing to be able to sell it cost competitively in the global market, something that I think Europe broadly, which is a global policy leader, but not always the biggest producer of carbon emissions already, needs to. How is the steel industry in Sweden thinking about this?
They are very, very happy about this fossil-free steel, and they are surprised of how many companies they now are calling them to want to buy it. That is a queue of consumer is staying there to want to buy this fossil-free steel, even that it is more or less 25% more expensive. The first big consumer is, of course, Volvo AB, and they think it's not so difficult to sell a truck which are fossil-free, because the cost is more or less 1 to 2 tires of the car or the truck. So it's not a big costs to be fossil free. And Mercedes and other companies are also in contract with SSAB that produces fossil free steel. So the value chain is the answer, you can say. The value chain reduce risks and also take part of the power of the money that you can get from this production. So I mean, they say to me that we can produce more. We can't produce so much that the market wants to buy, and they can sell this rather expensive fossil-free steel now.
That's must be very encouraging news, I think. And of course, like most developed economies, Sweden has most of its GDP coming in the end from the services sector of one form or another, which maybe it's in the distribution and logistics and transport. How do you see the progress in decarbonising that? I guess all around the world. You know, recently in another area, I interviewed someone from Japan talking about and also from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, talking about the Japanese car industry and, you know, the challenges they face with no natural renewable energy source in Japan. But how do you see the transport industry's progress? Do you think the ambitious goals that Sweden has can be achieved?
Yes, when we talk about this owner of roadmaps, they say we can manage to reduce our emissions by 70% by this new reduction law that we have introduced, that you put biofuel into gasoline and diesel during the period up to 2030. And this law makes this market very secure for example, bio refineries. And now they invest in different parts of Sweden to produce biofuel, biodiesel, and ethanol, and put it into gasoline and diesel. So we have a lot of resources in that perspective, and also a good history of using biomass in the heat sector. And of course, we also have companies that now see the possibility to make the production produce electric trucks and cars. And we have strong targets now, and I think most of us believe that it will be much easier to sell electric car 2030 than we think it's possible today. So the combination of sustainable cities that we don't use so many cars and we use more and bicycles and public transportation. We also combine with electric cars, trucks, and hydrogen also, of course, in the truck segment, you can say. Together, we can manage to reach our target.
Yes, again, we're going away from the questions, but this is what always happens to me with conversations. You mentioned hydrogen, but it doesn't strike me that Sweden is a natural place to produce green hydrogen. And importing it is also expensive. It's not the easiest, but you have this embrittlement issue. How are you thinking about hydrogen and the roadmaps in general for Sweden?
Yes, it's a very, very interesting question, and people are talking about hydrogen everywhere now. And it's because of two things, you can say. The global price on electricity is going down. We see on the wind power and the solar energy is going down over the time. And that's why we see new possibilities to produce rather cheap green hydrogen. But also electrolyzers are going down very fast. And they see the huge possibility when you look at the learning curve. We're not starting that process yet, but when we produce a lot of electrolyzers, the price will go down even there. So these two different causes, you can say, make it possible to produce cheap hydrogen, green hydrogen. And they believe that it will be more or less the same price at natural gas 2030. And in that perspective, they're now starting to invest in hydrogen in different part of the economy. We mentioned fossil steel, but also, of course, fossil-free iron. We want to export fossil-free iron from the LKAB to the whole world. And then can everyone more or less produce fossil-free steel all over the world? We also need the hydrogen in the transport sector, heavy trucks, as I mentioned, aviation, agriculture sector, and also in the refineries when they produce biofuels. They need a lot of hydrogen. So hydrogen is a key player when you talk about the transformation of the Swedish.
Svante, we're coming to the end of this conversation, so I'll just ask you one more quick question that just in general, has Sweden's decarbonisation so far, has it cost the government anything, or has taxes had to be raised in any way, shape or form, or what's been the net impact on the economy, do you think?
I think we have changed the language totally, because now we put incentives and reduce obstacles for the industrial investors to produce fossil-free steel, and that create welfare and export income to the whole country. So when we start to don't talk only about the households and the Swedes, how they want to reduce emissions, and put the pressure and the discussion on the industrial sector, we got a strong support from the whole society, from the unions, from environmental movements, and that's a big starting point, because when we change the production concept, it also be easier for all people in the world to be fossil-free themselves. So I think in 80s and 90s, we talked about the cost and was afraid about taxes and all that. We have introduced it, but now we have also using the law, and we see that the market is there, and then they can produce, as I mentioned, more expensive products, but the consumer is on the market today.
I must say, as an investment banking analyst, when I started looking at this myself very seriously, my boss in research at UBS asked me how seriously should we take this global warming thing. And that was that was back in 2006. That was the start of a very long journey for me, which goes on to this day. And to start with, I couldn't see, all I could see was the losers, like coal generation having to go away. But now when I look at the stock market, even in Australia, I see a lithium mining sector that's worth $40 billion, and, inverter companies out of Israel that are, very valuable. We see Elon Musk and Tesla and, the car companies, I think, are all in a race now, a new race. It's really the opportunities to start. There is a lobby group of winners from climate change that will be working very hard to make it happen faster. That would be just my observation. Look, I think it's time now for us to broaden out our discussion and to introduce two other panelists. As I mentioned already, Ellen Einebrant, Head of Communications and Recycling Industries of the Swedish Association, and also Marianne Hedberg, the environmental expert with the Swedish Construction Federation. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Marianne, I might just start with you and ask you about your roadmap, generally speaking, and how you see the process of decarbonisation. And I think before the panel started, we were talking very briefly about cement, and which is a big deal. Perhaps you might just want to repeat some of those comments.
Well, the cement industry has been very much in focus lately because we rely on one producer for something like 75% of the cement used in Sweden at the moment. And their environment permit was denied for now. And there's a lot of discussion and political actions and whatever. And I'm not going to go into that because that's a very political discussion right now. But what is happening is that the cement producers are working on reducing the carbon effect, the carbon emissions from productions. And you can obviously do this in two ways, either by mixing slag into the cement when it's produced, and thereby introducing a filler that's not causing carbon emissions in that production at least. And the other way is the carbon capture and storage, and what's called carbon capture and utilization. Both these, either you take out the CO2 from the production, you contain it, and either you put it away in a safe storage somehow, or you put it to use in other types of production. You could use the carbon molecules in producing plastics, for example. So this is being looked at very much. The process is in place. The companies are offering this and at a slightly higher cost. But as soon as this is being procured, it can be set to work. And this is one part of what's been going on in the construction business, and a very important part, because we obviously rely heavily on cement, even if we need to change over to other materials as well. And this is being done too.
And in the roadmap, do you think about the timber industry from Sweden, you know, which I suppose must also be important? I mean, sometimes I see people attempting to switch from concrete and or steel buildings towards timber buildings, wooden buildings, but I think myself this can only be a very limited application really, but perhaps I don't understand it properly.
Well, building with timber is being introduced even in large constructions right now, but you always need a combination of materials. And from the Construction Federation, we say we don't take a stand for one material only. We say each material in the right place. You have to choose wisely. You have to choose at the to reduce the climate impact of the construction or the structure as a whole. And you have to look at it in a long-term way. And from the end of this year, you need to present a climate calculation for every new construction being started. And this will give the producers and the builders, the construction companies, a very clear picture of what we are actually doing. What effect do we have when we are building, and how can we change this? Because the basis for any change is knowledge about where we stand, I believe.
Yes, that's it. First of all, you measure it and then you can control it. I think that's the basic rule I have always understood. Ellen, could I just ask you a little bit about the recycling industry? I think it only applies could you talk just even a bit about the size of the industry in terms of your members, who I know don't represent the entire industry, and kind of what are the biggest things that get recycled in Sweden from your members?
Yes, so the Swedish Recycling Industries is an organization that represents the private recycling companies. I think it's about 80% of the private market. And then in addition to the private recycling sector, municipalities in Sweden also conduct extensive recycling activities. But the approximately 60 members in our organization, about the bigger companies in Sweden, they have a turnover of just over 20 billion Swedish crowns and more than 6,000 employees. So they have more than 10 million tons of waste and recycled materials that is collected and processed every year in about 500 facilities across the country. So we work to increase recycling and resource efficiency in society. And according to national statistics, material recycling reduced greenhouse gas emissions by more than 7 million tons a year. And that's a positive, of course. However, fossil fuels are still used in transport, for heating and electricity consumption, and in various recycling and treatment processes. So in total, the entire industry was calculated greenhouse gas emissions amounts to 1.2 million tons a year, according to the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. And the main part arises from landfill, even though we're heavy on transport. So we have work to do.
Absolutely. And in some countries, look, I wasn't going to ask about this, but landfill in some countries, it's actually can be a source of electricity from the methane emissions, and you can burn them, capture them. Do you do any of that in Sweden?
Yes, we do. And we also have calls for politicians in our roadmap. We want the politicians to introduce requirements to take care of leaking methane gas from landfills with organic waste. So that's one of our calls for politicians.
Yes, and Marianne, I might come back to you. We've talked a little bit about cement and about timber. What other materials, or is it a materials focus that you think about, or a whole of construction life cycle?
Well, we need to have a look at the whole life cycle, and we need to, sorry Svante, but we need to broaden the perspective to sustainability. We cannot focus only on climate and risk ending up with the situation that the operation was successful, but the patient died. We need to have a look in each and every situation, what is the best material to use here. And we cannot do without any of these materials. There are new invention, I mean, or old inventions, bricks for left-handed, was it so? What you said? And that they have been used a lot for a long time here in Sweden. And there are various materials that can be utilized. And if we have a proper climate calculation, and we can change the construction phase or in the planning phase, we can change and look at various impacts from various materials, and we have an open mind already in the idea stage of construction. This means we have a freedom of choosing the right things and reducing the impact overall. So it's important to get started very early.
It is always important to start early. And it's going to be important to finish on time. So I think it will also be right for us to move to Q&A from our audience now. And we must have said something interesting, because there are some questions, which is just great. I'd like to, one that was asked was about the production of biofuels, which is sort of, to me, I always wonder about the emissions actually in the production of biofuels. Svante, what would you say about that?
Yes, we have a discussion all over the world about the biofuels, if they are good or bad. But of course, we need to produce sustainable biofuels and take care of the nature and the biodiversity. So we have different types of biomass, bad biomass and good biomass, you can say. And the forest in Sweden is going in the right direction. We are not in the heaven, but we have taken step by step to be more sustainable. And it's important to see that we only use rest products when we talk about biofuels, biomass, from the timber production and the pulp production. So we don't use the whole tree to burn it up. You just use the rest products, and I think that's much better than putting up oil from in the production system. So I mean, we need to choose between biofuels or fossil fuels, and then I think the answer is easy.
Clearly that's the case, but still the actual burning of the sawdust or wood chips or whatever the waste is, it still actually does involve some emissions at that point, doesn't it? Just less.
Yeah. And but we can't just today. We have the cars all over the world. We have the aviation. We have this industrial system we have today. We can't use electricity or hydrogen all over just now. So we have to phase out the fossil fuels. And I think in that perspective, it's better for the planet if we use biofuels compared to fossil energy. We can't solve the problem only by electricity and hydrogen and so on.
No. Now, another question, which is, I think, something we could learn about, is the roadmaps, and it's another question for you. It's just the engagement from industry. You've mentioned several times that industry is now, in a sense, the people pushing, particularly, I suppose, those industries that have something to gain from it in the natural way of things. But in the original roadmap development, are these plans, who owns the plans? Do they owned by industry, or are they owned by government, or do they have to be approved by you? How does all that work?
And that's a very important question, because that's a success factor, you can say, that they own their own roadmaps. They produce them themselves and they own it, and they are responsible for it. In many countries have produced roadmaps, but not so many countries have produced roadmaps voluntary by the sectors themselves. And that's a key factor, because then they also all over time have a communication how it works, what they need to do, or what the politicians need to do if we want to manage to reach these targets. And
again, I'm not sufficiently familiar, but there's a question about Sweden's nuclear power plants and what the outlook for them is. Maybe we could, if they are going to be closed, as some are in Europe generally, what will Sweden do to replace them?
The situation in Sweden now is that you can build new nuclear power plants if you want. It's not forbidden to use them. It's a voluntary process that the companies phase out some of them because it's too costly to have them in production. So that's the situation just now, and just for 2 years ago or 1.5, we phased out 2 old nuclear power plants because it was too costly. It was a voluntary process. But when we look forward, it's very expensive to produce nuclear power plants. And that's why we talk about how we can use the wind production and offshore production. So it's a market solution, you can say. Nobody say that it's possible to build new nuclear power plants today without subsidies. So that's the situation. And that's why we also see that we are going to be more or less total 100% renewable all over time, but we don't have an exactly time when we are there.
No, we're always racing against time. Always have been, always will be, for something or other. I would add that nuclear production historically has been very baseloady, and that actually is not a good thing. It has to be backed up with something else. Maybe it's not so hard in Sweden where you can import power. But actually, it's not the modern way of doing it. And I want to ask some other questions, but I'll just quickly come back about the prospects for Sweden to grow its wind industry more, particularly offshore wind, I suppose. Do you have a lot of possibilities?
Yes, Sweden is more or less an island, you can say, a lot of coast and very good, many places to produce offshore wind. And we can use this old nuclear power plants sites to connect this electric cables from the sea, but also a lot of land, So we have huge good possibilities to produce wind on land and offshore.
Yes, and as I said, I think your hydro industry can be a great export to the rest of Europe, at least when I look at it from here in Australia, where it's like watching the football. It's always so easy when you're looking at it on the TV. I might just come back and ask Ellen again about circular Sweden. We talked about recycling, but just talk a little bit about circular Sweden to me for a minute. And I think we're going to run out of time soon, but it interests me.
Yeah, so that's a network. In the recycling industry, we saw that a lot of companies wanted to have more circular material and product flows. So we said we have to work together on this. We have to influence politics together. So we are a couple of companies with that really wants to do something about this, their material and product flows. And we want it to be more circular. So we are standing together and try to create concrete political solutions. And it has been a sort of a success.
That's good. And let me think. So we have a question here about back to Svante about who recruits or negotiates companies to join in the roadmaps.
Pardon, once more time.
Yes. How does a company get to be involved, or a business get to be involved in a roadmap in the first place? Do they have to be invited, or does their association do it, or do they?
Yes, it was a very open process, and I asked them. I just asked them if they want to produce their own roadmap, and the argumentation was different in different sectors. But the main argumentation was that it was a good way to show the society as a whole that they have possibilities, they have new technology, and they can put pressure on the parliament if they was brave and say that they will be part of the solution. So they changed the role, you can say, and say yes to be fossil free, and say, but we need also do something else to make it possible for them. So it was a strategic choice that they did.
And I have another question about the chemical and oil industries. I don't suppose there's much oil production in Sweden, but there's chemicals certainly, which generally start with gas or a petrochemical as the feedstock. How's the roadmap looking there?
The chemical industry was the only one who didn't produce any roadmap, but we have a discussion with them, and we have taken them into account when we now have different strategies to show how we can implement hydrogen or biomass and so on. So you can say in the first step, they want to shift from fossil hydrogen to green hydrogen. And then, of course, they want to use biomass and the coal in the biomass, not only the energy, to produce green products in the future. So they are part of this puzzle, you can say, and a strong consumer of hydrogen, and in the long run also they need biomass from the forest. And
actually, Camilla, I might ask you in the background there, are we still going to be doing our poll at some stage? If not, that's also okay. But I just thought if we were going to be running the poll, maybe now would be a time to do that.
I think, David, I think we have quite a lot of questions here, so we might run through them.
Okay.
Don't you think? It's quite a few in the Q&A as well here.
Good. So then the next one is about just transition, which is a phrase we hear a lot. Speaking as someone who likes to be inclusive, but most jobs are done today in the world by those jobs didn't exist 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. And I'm sure that in 50 years' time, the jobs that my grandchildren are doing won't necessarily be jobs that exist today. So how does a society and an economy manage this transition, as away from fossil fuels? Is there a single way to do it, or is this part of the plans that industries need to come up with?
It's a question to me.
I suppose it is, Svante, yes.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, that's a huge challenge, perhaps the most difficult one. But even here, we can say that we have a tradition in Sweden that we take care of each other in different parts of Sweden. So we have a lot of trust in the society, and people are not so afraid about losing jobs because they know that the state will support them with new jobs. And we try now to, for example, when we close down the production of engines, we also in the same city starting the production of electric components to the electric cars. We see that the north of Sweden that needs to have a lot of unemployment, there we have a boost now with different investors from different parts of the world to produce steel and iron, as I mentioned. So I think this is, of course, a very, very tough situation that we need a lot of education. We need to create new competence in different parts of the sectors. So that's a very, very strong challenge. But I think we have a good position because the history is good for us. We have a lot of trust in the society for that.
And I apologise to our other participants, but a lot of the questions are coming towards sectors that we haven't talked about. I could ask about aviation, but I think I'd ask about agriculture, which interests me to start with. You know, land clearing, possibly most of the land that's going to be cleared in Sweden has already been cleared. But in general, there are also replanting. You can get carbon credits and things like that. What happens in the agricultural sector in Sweden?
Agricultural sector is the most difficult one in the long run. But as you perhaps saw, did you see that in the roadmap, we want to be fossil free in the agriculture sector when we talk about changing fuels. But there are so many other different gases that they need to handle. So there we have a lot of challenges. And of course, we need to have a system where we bind CO2 in the soil all over the time. And that's not the situation today. So we don't have the answer, you can say, on how we will be to climate neutral in the agriculture sector. So that's the most difficult one just now.
And I have a question here, Ellen, for you about Sweden's national recycling targets. Is there one or sector-specific targets? And if there are, well, let's just start there.
Yeah, we have different targets to increase recycling in different materials, but we need more targets, I would say. We have been asking for targets connected to the use of recycling materials. We have no targets connected to the use of recycled materials, and that's where we have the big climate effect. We could have high targets for recycling, but if no one wants to buy their recycled materials, we won't get the climate effect from using recycled materials. So that's the next step for Sweden. We need those targets as well.
Yes, I think the recycled plastics industry has made a lot of progress globally. You know, look, I think we're actually getting very close to 5 o'clock, so I might actually make that to have been the last question. And on behalf of myself, I'd like to say thanks to all of our panelists for talking today. I've really enjoyed being invited to be part of this discussion, and thanks very much, and I'll hand back now.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you so much, Ambassador Cederin. Thank you, Svante Axelsson, Ellen Einebrant, and Marianne Hedberg. It has been a very interesting discussion here. We have a lot of questions in the chat still, so what we have done is that we save all these questions and we will answer it as a follow-up from this event. Have a look at our website for upcoming events. We do regular events together with the Embassy of Sweden here in Australia, and also together with Business Sweden. Thank you very much once again, and have a great evening and a fantastic day back in Sweden.